Hi, you guys. I am so excited because this is the last video lecture for Unit 2. So I will be talking to you primarily about forced migration. Mr. Beilstein covered some of the basics of migration and voluntary migration and Ravenstein's laws of migration, which is probably the most challenging part of migration. But ultimately, I think a lot of this will be pretty familiar to you. There's like some essential vocabulary that I have to share, but for the most part, forced migration and then some of the effects of migration is pretty straightforward. So I'm excited to bring you the last lecture. That means Unit 1 and 2 are essentially a wrap with learning. So we still have a little bit more migration stuff to do next week, and then your assessment for this unit is October 19th. So as long as you're watching the videos, I've already given you many reminders of that. Okay, so the learning targets that I will be covering are the two on the screen. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about forced migration. Voluntary migration, like I said, was covered in the last learning target lecture. So I'm going to be talking to you about forced migration, and then I am going to be explaining the political, economic, and cultural effects of migration on both the countries where the migrants leave and the countries where the migrants arrive. And just a little bit of a plug. I think that you might have noticed that I highlighted the optional extra credit opportunity, like in the weekly agenda where it said, "This is my favorite video." It is seriously so good. I'm pretty sure I linked it to the middle of the week. So for those of you that are watching this, if you're a Monday, if you're Tuesday, Thursday, then it would have been on the Tuesday. And if you're Wednesday, Friday, it would have been on the Wednesday. You guys, oh, you will not regret it. It's so good. It's all about voluntary migration. Okay. All right. So let's talk about types of migration. So forced migration, what is it? Ooh, I'll move this so you can see the graphic. So forced migration is human migration in which the movers have no choice but to move. So essentially, you are forced to migrate if your life is at risk, or in some cases, like you see slavery and human trafficking there, if you like literally don't have a choice. So the quintessential example of forced migration, or the best historical example of forced migration, is of course the transatlantic slave trade or slavery that you are familiar with. Now, human trafficking is a modern day reimagination of the term. It literally means slavery, but we call it human trafficking now. And there is not a country in the world that does not have, actually, I should take that back. I don't necessarily know about Iceland, but most major industrialized countries in the world have some form of slavery still present and happening within the borders of their country. In fact, if you were to look at the number of slaves that exist current day, it actually exceeds the number of slaves that existed during the period when slavery was actually not illegal. So this is a very real issue. There's a link here that I'm going to attach to the Edpuzzle. So if you want to learn a little bit more about modern day human trafficking, I'm going to go ahead and put that in the link as an optional video for you to watch. Now, forced migrations, if you are a migrant and you are forced to move, there's a couple terms associated with that. So I'm going to discuss those in just a minute on the next slide. So we'll get to that in just a second. So what causes most types of forced migration? Most forced migration happens because of either war, oppression, or more and more frequently because of natural disasters. There is so much information that's coming out right now about forced migration as a result of climate change that I'm going to link a couple of different resources for you to peruse on your own. Some climate change, scary climate change stuff as it relates to migration and forced migration in particular. But I'm going to save that for you to just sort of explore on your own. Okay, so what is a refugee? A refugee is one type of forced migrant. A refugee is someone who's facing some sort of persecution or abuse from their government. A refugee, and this includes like countries that are at war, so people fleeing war. Usually, war is a political event, so that would constitute a refugee. Refugees are international, meaning they flee from one country to another, and they are normally seeking asylum. So they are seeking they are in need of shelter and protection in another country. Asylum seeking to like we think of this, it's pretty easy to think of it in terms of war, but a lot of the controversy that was happening in this country with people coming from the south of the border, like south of the Mexican border, that were coming into this country, were actually seeking asylum because they were from a very dangerous place of Central America called the Northern Triangle. And there was so much political strife. I mean, basically, the gangs were sort of running the government that, especially if you were a young woman, you were fleeing your country to come to the United States and seek in search of asylum. And so a lot of times, like, that becomes a really complicated issue for the conversation of like illegal immigration. So we can get into that a little bit more at one of our Thursday meetings if you guys are interested. Okay, so what is the difference? There's another type of person who is a forced migrant, and that is an internally displaced person. So I want to give you some information about what this is. So an IDP is a person, is basically a refugee who doesn't move to a new country for a variety of different reasons. Either it isn't safe for them to leave because they might be in the center and then all around them is conflict occurring, or perhaps they don't have any money and just like literally cannot leave. However, they are really in dire straits because they face all the hardships of a refugee. They are in fear of their life on the regular, but they just don't have the means or the opportunity to leave. And when you think about this, like, refugees are afforded certain status by the international community. They are actually allowed to, like, it's legal for them to cross international borders to seek asylum and not be thrown in jail as like an illegal migrant. But if you are an IDP, you are not afforded any of the privileges or the status guaranteed by the international community, particularly the United Nations. And in fact, when you think about the host government, the country where the problems are actually happening, the government's responsibility is supposed to be to take care of its people. But IDPs, as sort of mentioned above, are facing some really difficult challenges. And as mentioned before, a refugee is being discriminated against by their government. So is an IDP. So it's really not safe for these people to stay in their country. But again, they have no other option. It's like a really sad thing. So let's just look at like some examples of like a forced migration event. And so gosh, I made it so tangential on this slideshow, but like I had just recently heard that there was like well, I'll tell you the story in a minute. So many of you are probably familiar with the Syrian civil war that happened here in Syria in the Middle East. And as a result of that, there was this massive migration. It was one of the biggest in history, just next to World War II. So it was like the second one since World War II. There were so many people on the move that were fleeing Syria for safety as asylum seekers or refugees. Now, when you look at this, some of Ravenstein's laws come into place here as well. The vast majority of the migrants who were leaving Syria ended up in Turkey, right, or the surrounding countries, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and some in Iraq. Although Iraq is really unstable too, so it's like you don't really want to go there. In Turkey, there was some major issues too, but anyway, you kind of get the gist. And so that's Ravenstein's laws. Like, most migrants tend to move shorter distances. And so just to give you an idea of that, now when, like, let's take Turkey as an example here. Turkey was overwhelmed by migrants. Now the Turkish government does not have the means to take care of all of the people that were migrating into its borders. So this is where you might see like international cooperation to try and like help Turkey provide for the refugees that are here, because once a person who's a refugee who's seeking asylum makes it into your country, it's the country's responsibility to then take care of them. They don't always do this very well. In fact, this is very problematic actually, and you can see that these are all refugee camps just right here on the border. So pretty crazy place to live. Not a lot of food, not a lot of shelter. Fights break out, etc. So migrants that go to Turkey, and you can see just this is a great map. It shows some flows. It's a graduated symbol map because it's showing you like how many refugees are moving and from where they're moving and how they're moving. And so you can see overwhelmingly the majority of the Syrian refugees were fleeing from Syria into Turkey, right? So now you can kind of see how these migration patterns are beginning to look. And then, as a result of things being so bad in Turkey, a lot of the migrants decided to sort of move from Turkey into Europe. And they're all, like, a lot of them were actually heading to Germany. And so this is where population and migration become really uniquely intertwined. Remember that Germany is having a population problem. Their population is aging. And so there's a lot of stress being placed upon the working population of Germany. And so Germany is like, please come to Germany. We want to welcome you. And if you're not like a geographer or a demographer, you may just make the assumption that Germany's so nice. Like they're so nice to let all these migrants and they just want to help the Syrian refugees. When in actuality, it's the refugees going to work that are actually going to help the German population take care of its elderly triangle upside down thing that's going on with its a high elderly dependency ratio. So it's not just altruistic on Germany's in Germany's perspective, right? There's a need, there's an economic need for this as well. Now, this becomes, and if you guys, there's a video attached to Thursday, Friday, that it does a really good job of describing the situation and how challenging it is for migrants to move from Turkey into Europe. Many of them decided to take this little path right here, and thousands of refugees actually lost their lives. You may even remember like the little boy that was found on the beach in Greece that had died. He was 2 years old, and a photographer snapped his picture and brought this crisis to the place where it should be, in the international stage, and created an awareness of what was actually happening. So many refugees fled across into Greece, and I'm going to go to the next slide. And you can kind of see here the route that they were taken. And I'm going to, I don't usually throw questions into the Edpuzzle, but I'm going to throw a question into the Edpuzzle for this map. And that is, what terms are being illustrated by this map? You should have at least 2 vocabulary terms that you are familiar with from the lecture yesterday or from the lecture previous that you could apply to this map. So I want to see you do that in the Edpuzzle. Okay, so when migrants finally arrive to their host country, it is not easy for them. So the citizens of a host country may dislike the newcomers' cultural differences, right? We're moving from the Middle East into Europe, and as you can see in the picture here, Muslims go home. There's quite a bit of hostility when you are moving somebody who's completely culturally different than you are into that. These people are moving into your country. I'm not saying that it's right, but it is what happens. um, More significantly, politicians sometimes exploit immigrants as scapegoats for local and economic problems. So you see this in our country all the time. They're taking our jobs. They're not taking our jobs. That's not at all what's happening. And in fact, this country in particular relies on its guest worker programs, particularly in the agricultural sector, because most Americans don't actually want to do those jobs. So we need immigrant labor to come in and do the picking of like things like strawberries, which is just a hard manual labor. In addition, governments might face financial difficulties taking care of some of these refugees slash migrants that come in. So once you have refugees entering into a country, it is the responsibility of the host government to take care of them, to provide them housing and healthcare and education. So this could lead to increased taxes for the citizens of the host country, which again, kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of problems. And then depending on like your physiological density, I guess you could say this could be a strain on natural resources as well for the host country. And we'll get into some more of the benefits and drawbacks in just a minute. So the last thing that I want to say is that there's security issues. And so you may actually remember when the Syrian refugee crisis was happening, and it's like probably height 2015, 2016. There were subsequent terrorist attacks that occurred because people from the Middle East were sneaking in as refugees into some of these European countries and causing all kinds of trouble. Okay, so a couple of the effects of migration. So there's effects on the countries of origin. So this is where the migrants are leaving from, right? And this is not just related to forced migration. This is also related to voluntary migration. So these effects are related to both, okay? Voluntary and forced migration. So a positive effect on the country of origin is relief from overcrowding. Remember when Mr. Baustein went over Zelensky's migration transition model? So like who's moving where and when? You know from the DTM that there's high population growth in stage 2 and still growing population even slowly in stage 3, that there could be problems with that. Like people need jobs, right? And so they may move or migrate to countries in stage 4 or 5 who have those opportunities, and that relieves some of those overcrowding, exceeding carry capacity, all that kind of stuff. The negative effect on the country of origin is that working age people are leaving. In Eastern Europe, the reason why there's such a high elderly dependency ratio is not because of a lack of people who are having babies, although these two things are connected. It's because young people are leaving the country to go to live in another country that's A, provides more opportunity, or B, is just more exciting to them. Culturally, undercuts traditional family structures just a little bit, because a lot of the times the people that are leaving, as you remember from Ravenstein's laws, are young men internationally. Again, that trend is shifting here in the United States, primarily because of what I told you earlier about how girls are a target, in particular in the Northern Triangle, so they tend to leave in droves. But if you have the man leaving, then that becomes problematic, of course, because the family structure begins to shift. Um, in China, like you have massive migration from rural to urban centers. So you have urban populations that are swelling. So you have rapid urban population growth, and sometimes the countries can't keep up with how fast the cities are growing. And then the last thing is brain drain, right? Your best and brightest are just leaving. And so what does that leave you? Like in some cases, they're returning. Like that's happening. People might come here to the United States to get an education and then they go home. This is particularly true for India, where the second, um, Silicon Valley sprouted up. So people came here to learn all about tech and then they go home and start their own businesses. But in general, brain drain is not a good thing for the country of origin. And then finally, the effects on the receiving country are mixed as well. So this would be like, what are the effects on the country of that they're leaving and going to? So migrants from Central America coming here to the United States, what's the effect on us? So there's some cultural contributions that are really positive, right? New foods, new words, languages, diversity, forms of entertainment, variety of religious traditions. Typically, this cultural diversity is a positive. But again, as mentioned before, it could be negative. It could lead to cultural conflict as well. So it's a little bit gray. A lot of times migrants will come here and they'll start their own businesses like restaurants, nail salons, other services. Um, Remittances. So remittances is when a migrant comes to a country, this is usually for voluntary reasons, gets a job and then sends money home. So the statistic on the screen right now is really important. So nearly 40% of the income of countries in Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan, which is in Central Asia, like 40% of the income of that country is dependent upon remittances, people that leave and then send money home. Remittances is actually more important to countries in some cases than like international aid. More money comes in because other people are leaving and sending money home. So most of the countries of origin, so where are people going to work is the United States and Saudi Arabia. And then where are they sending money home? India and China. So that's kind of just a fun fact. And I already mentioned the conflicts. So you can have cultural diversity, which is positive, but also cultural conflicts between people of different religious beliefs, cultural practices, jobs comes up often, border security concerns I already mentioned. And then again, like it's expensive if you see a swell in your population to provide schooling, police, emergency services, and so on and so forth. Infrastructure needs to be built, and so on and so forth. And I believe that that is it. So happy day on the last slide of, or last Google slide presentation on Unit 2. Congratulations, you're 2/7 of the way through.